Hey everybody, Riot Mort here, and we are back with the patch 13.1 rundown, the start of a new year, which means a new patch and a bunch of new changes. If this is your first patch rundown, the way this works is we're going to go over all the changes that are happening, mostly on the gameplay side, because there are some other stuff coming, some new cosmetics for the Lunar New Year. But this is primarily focused around what's going to change in the gameplay, some champions or traits or augments, things like that. As well as some system changes, things like that. So yeah, let's jump right into it. There's a lot to go over. It's a pretty big patch. A lot of things needed some slight adjustments. So let's dive right into it. So first up on the system side, Krugs, that's the PvE fight in Stage 2-7, are now guaranteed to drop at least 2 item components. This should help a little bit with the item distribution. Sometimes you'd have players that would come out of Krugs with like 4 items and others with like 6 or 7. This should help that a little bit, trying to make sure that there isn't quite as big a discrepancy in the early game where it matters the most. In addition, we're changing some of our augment distribution a little bit. We've heard a lot of the feedback coming off of, the first patch of Monsters Attack, and there were a bit too many prismatic games in conjunction with the hero augments, as well as, frankly, a few too many silver augment games. So we're trying to normalize it a bit and get back to that gold feeling like the standard here. And so basically what you're going to see is a reduction in silver augments and prismatic augments and an increase in gold augments. So you can see here gold will be at least in 92% of your games. Prismatic dropping almost about half as much as it was in the last patch. Also, some of the patterns have been changed a little bit. Hero Prismatic Silver was very awkward. You had your hero augment, you had a prismatic, you were on these high highs, and then it ended with silver. It was very awkward, so we're changing that to gold. Prismatic Hero Prismatic was just a little too inflationary, so we're going Prismatic Hero Gold. And then same with Prismatic Hero, that will be Gold Prismatic Hero. Finally, in 4.2, it is now possible 5% of the time. We're just going to give you 3 5-cost hero augments. The 5-cost hero augments don't show up very often, so this should give everyone a little bit more chance to play with those hero augments, because there's some pretty fun ones in there. And then one last change to the opening carousel. There was a carousel pattern that's been around for a long time that was 3 tiers, 3 gloves, and 3 random components. The problem with this one is sometimes you would get things like 6 tiers, 3 gloves, and it would look really awkward. So we're going to try to change that to 3 tiers, 3 gloves, 3 belts. Belt seemed like a nice one that has some good uses, can be strong in the early game, and so hopefully this opens up a bunch of different play patterns off that opening carousel. Cool. And so some of those augment distributions like I talked about, here's what that looks like for people who really like the charts, really like the numbers. So take a second, you can screenshot it and use this to get the information you're looking for. All right, on the trait side, first off, we have to talk about admin. Admin, the trait that is, full of a ton of different possibilities here. So first thing to talk about is we're buffing 6 admin. We want to make sure that's really worth it. So now it's just going to double the effect of all the other admins. So that's a pretty big buff here. It used to be plus 80%. Now it's just going to double. Should be make it really easy to read too, right? So if you have like start of combat gain 25 AP, now it's 50. Very easy to understand. We've also re-enabled the on-kill cause. This was one that was disabled due to its wording being very confusion, and we had the localization that was kind of locked. So now it's in the game and should be very clear. And the way this one works is your team gains the ability on kill gain X. So for example, you could be running 2 admin and your Riven gets a kill. Your Riven might gain 20 permanent HP. So that's the way that works. It's not everyone on the team. It's literally whoever gets the kill. So with that, we came some adjustments. Permanent HP is now at 20, AD, AP, attack speed all at 25, mana at 40, heal still at 350, and gold drop at 50%. So that's a new cause to play with, so check that out. When admin drops below 40%, this is the hardest one to play around probably. I think this is probably the least picked. Next patch, we're going to buff that up to 66% so it can trigger much earlier. But for now, we couldn't really do that. So for now, it's just getting some buffs to things like the permanent HP, the AD, AP, and attack speed. So if you can come up with a clever way to, get your Soraka to take some damage and then get back up to full, this can give you a ton of power. On Ally Death, this is the one that's very much like the old Darkstar trait. This is getting a buff on the AP side, mana side, heal side, and gold drop side. On Spellcast, Admin heal for 200 got a little bit of a buff. At combat start, Admin gained 60 AD. This was really strong on Camille, probably too strong. So this is going to get set back to 50, very much like the other things for the other stats like AP and attack speed. So still strong for Camille, just maybe not quite as strong. On combat start, Team gains, probably the easiest to use and the strongest. Gets a bit of a nerf, 15 HP now instead of 20, 25 AP, 25 AD instead of 30. But the gold drop is getting buffed a little bit. So if you want to get that gold, you can try to get that. Every 5 seconds, Admin gains. The gold drop is going up a little bit. As you can see, we're kind of buffing all the gold drop ones. We want those to be kind of exciting to play around. And then finally, every 5 seconds, Team gains. The permanent HP is going down. Used with Brawler ends up being pretty crazy, so we're bringing that down a little bit. But the attack speed and the gold drop are going up. So Admin's going to be this trait that's going to have a lot of levers we're going to have to keep an eye on. But there you go. On the other trait side, Ace. Ace 1 is getting a bit of a buff. This should help things like Draven, Samira, and Misfortune a little bit. If you want to run one Ace, it'll also help the Ace emblem. So if you see an Ace emblem, this should be a little bit more tempting. Brawler 6 and 8. Clearly, Jax is a big part of their power budget, but even without the Jax, it's just a very strong frontline. You can run like an 8 Brawler 2 admin with a Soraka carry, and that can do a lot of work. It's just really too much health to chew through. So we're going to nerf 6 Brawler, just 5%, but 8 Brawler especially, because it's not that hard to get. You only need one emblem. That's going to go down all the way from 111 to 90%, so that's a pretty big nerf. Duelist. This is an interesting trait that is very, very strong in the early game. If you get 6 Duelist on like 3-1, 3-2, you're probably win streaking till around 5-1. It does fall off though. And so what we want to do is keep its peak at the same level, but lower how quickly it turns on, especially for those longer fights in the early game. So what's happening here is they're losing some of the attack speed per auto, but their maximum ends up being very similar. So for example, if you have 2 Duelists, now instead of 6 attack speed per auto, you're only gaining 5, but the cap is still 60%. So just going to slow down that Duelist ramping a little bit, especially at 6 and 8. Laser Core. We're probably going to have a bigger change for Laser Core in the next patch, but for now, Laser Core gets a bit of a buff. So should make this a little bit better in the early game. Mascot healing was very strong. We saw a lot of, especially with the reroll supers mascot comps. So mascot 4, 6, and 8 are being brought down quite a bit. Remember, the mascots gain double this as well. So for example, if you've got 4 mascot before, they were gaining 6.5%. Now they're only gaining 5%. So that's quite a big chunk to their healing. So that should make them a little more balanced compared to the rest of the front lines as well. Recon's AI has been updated to better avoid crowds, so hopefully that should help them actually roll to safety like they say they should. Supers clearly has been providing a ton of power to reroll compositions. We're bringing that down quite a bit here actually, so the base damage is going from 20 to 18, and then the damage per 3-star is going from 5 to 3%. So for example, let's say you had 3 supers and Galio, Nasus, and Yumi all 3-starred. Beforehand, that was 50% damage. Now that's only going to be 39%. So an 11% cut there. That's pretty big. Should be a little less damage. Hopefully I did that math right in my head. But the point is, it got hit pretty hard. So Spellslingers. Spellslinger 4, 6, and 8 have all been overperforming quite a bit. So they're getting a little less AP. 5 AP off of Spellslinger 4, 15 off 6. 6 especially was very powerful. And then 8 is going down 25. 8 also, we're lowering its meteor damage. It still gets the triple meteor damage, so it's still very strong. But it is lowering a bit. And then finally, Spellslingers had this really awkward thing where at the start of the combat, instantaneously they would fire off a meteor. And with 6 Spellslinger, that could like delete a unit sometimes. So now they actually have to wait 5 seconds before they get their first meteor as intended. So this should bring Spellslingers back down in line without having to nerf the champions too much. Speaking of champions, Galio easily the best frontliner in stage 2. It wasn't even close. Really high health. Give him a Warmogs. Have that mascot healing keep him up. But in addition, his spell would shield not only him, but an ally near him, allowing that shield to give time for like the mascot healing. Really too strong, so we're bringing Galio down. Should hopefully bring him in line with other frontliners in the early game. He also provides Civilian. He's a ton of value in this champion. He'll still be quite good. Silas, a little bit weak for an Anima frontliner. We want to make sure he can survive as a frontliner. So he now gets 50 more base health, and his spell will heal a little bit more. So this should allow Silas to stay alive a little bit more in the early game. Maybe be willing to put stuff like a Warmogs or a Ionic on him. Talon, we want to be really careful with Talon because a Talon that gets out of control can be pretty frustrating to fight. But we are going to give him a little bit of attack speed so he can auto a little bit more. And then his spell damage is going up just a little bit, not even 5%. So just a tiny bit to make sure Talon's, a champion that you're actually excited to get a 2-star in the early game. So, all right, kind of a big change here, but not really, for the 2 and 3 costs. Basically, in this set, we have a framework that we use to deal with their spell scaling. And the way it works is every champion, when they star up, their spell damage scales 50%. Then at 2 cost, when they 3-star, that would go up 60%. We're lowering that to 55% across the board. And then with 3-cost champions, we're lowering it from 75% to 65% across the board. So basically, this is all 3-star, 2 and 3-cost champions getting their damage nerfed just a little bit, so that they all fall within the framework. Now, a bunch of champions got other balance adjustments, so they're listed elsewhere in the patch notes. But for the champions that aren't, you can see here Annie, Draven, Fiora, Malphite, Rel, Sivir, Yasuo on the 2-cost side all get that tiny reduction here. And then on the 3-cost side, Alistar, Kai'Sa, Neela, Riven, Sona, both Sonas, and the Zoe get hit a little bit here. So again, just lowering the power of some of these 2 and 3-cost reroll comps just a little bit here to try to make more options like the 4 and 5 costs viable, and should just be a healthier distribution of power in the champions. So, all right, back to champions. Annie, definitely an insanely powerful champion with Oxforce, Spellslinger, and Gadgettine. We want to keep her strong. She's still going to be strong, just a little less so. So it's just a little bit less mana, so she's not going to be able to cast her spell nearly as much. And the shield isn't going to be quite as powerful. Remember, this scales with Spellslinger also. So lowering the base a decent chunk here, almost 10%. So a little more than 10%. Cool. Camille's just a tiny adjustment here. This is just making sure the math is right on her spell. But at 1-star, she actually gets a little bit of a buff. And then at 3-star, just gets a little bit of a nerf on her spell. Nothing too crazy. Draven saw a little bit of a success with the mech build. But otherwise, really wasn't someone you'd be excited to hit. We want to make sure Draven is someone that, like, if you have a Last Whisper and a sword in the early game and a Draven 1, it's okay to play it. It's okay to get some good damage here. So this combined with the Ace buff and his little bit of attack speed should help him without buffing the crazy mech build, because that usually relies on him casting a spell over and over. This allows him to auto attack pretty quick, and so Draven should be a champion you're okay getting in your shop with AD items. Ezreal's not underperforming by any means, but a lot of his power is in his hero augment. You're going to see later his hero augment is nerfed, and his base damage is buffed a bit. So we want to make sure Ezreal, again, like, you get a 2-star Ezreal even without the hero augment, that you can play it a bit. So just a small spell damage buff here. All right, Jinx, probably one of the harder champions to play, and kind of a reason why Anima Squad struggles in the early game. We want to make sure Jinx is a really good item holder. So we're giving Jinx both 5 AD and a little bit more spell damage on her spell. This will hopefully allow Jinx to even hold like AD items for Vayne if you need, as well as AP items. So it should make her pretty flex and pretty powerful. And hopefully this is the buff that something like Anima Squad can also benefit from. Vi, just a little bit of an adjustment here. Vi 3 in particular was way too strong, shredding 70% of the enemy's armor. That level of shred is just really hard to deal with. So we're stabilizing her to just 50% shred across the board. Yumi, everyone's favorite cat. This champion certainly did a lot here. We're going to index on the side of safety here. This might be a slight over nerf, but we're making one change that's really good here, which is that her range is going from 5 to 4. What this means is she isn't going to be able to just hook and instantly kill your carry without maybe being on like the second row, which puts her in a lot of danger. So positioning changes for Yumi will matter here. And then the damage is going down pretty substantially here. You can see this is about 15% damage nerf. And this is in addition to the supers nerf we already saw, the mascot nerf, stuff like that. So hopefully this gets Yumi back to a more balanced state. So yeah. All right, Jax. Jax, probably the other big offender of power here. Jax has a lot of the power. So much power, in fact, that you don't really want to play a mech. You just play him with Brawler, and he has a ton of health, and he stacks up and does too much. So we're lowering his AD a bit, because we want to keep his damage mostly focused on his spell. His spell-based damage is only going down a little bit, not quite even 10%. But the stacking is going down pretty substantially here. You can see this is almost a 50 or 33% nerf, give or take. And so what this means is if you look before, remember the max is 7 stacks. So for example, at 1 star, you could get the spell all the way up to 340. Now you can only get it up to 240. So that's a pretty big nerf to Jax. Should hopefully get him back to comparable to the rest of the champions in the game. Still can be a carry. We want him to be a carry, but maybe not quite as strong. Kai'Sa, very minor adjustment here. Kai'Sa 2, just a little too strong, and Kai'Sa 3, pretty strong. So we're just lowering the spell attack speed a little bit. We like that Kai'Sa, when she procs her spell, hits really hard. Kai'Sa 3 should still be a win condition. Just a little bit of an adjustment there, nothing crazy. Vayne. Vayne and Kai'Sa are kind of like, you know, the yin and yang a little bit. But Vayne was definitely the one underperforming, only doing okay in Duelist, but we want to make sure she can also perform in things like Anima, as well as use her hero augment well. So we're buffing her spell a little bit, so it can use AD items a little bit more, get more of that true damage, can maybe shred through some tanks a little bit, and then fixing some math on the 3-star to make sure it fits the new framework here. So, cool. And then finally, Vel'Koz, probably one of the more frustrating champions. 2 Vel'Kozes especially can really lock down a team. So we're letting him lock things down a little less by lowering his mana 10 and then lowering his damage a little bit. He's still going to be a threat, pun intended, but just a little bit less powerful there. All right, now onto the bigger stuff. Some 4-cost changes. Okay, so Bel'Veth is a champ that was underperforming a little bit, and I think you might be surprised to see some nerfs here. But the big thing is we discovered a bug that was not allowing Bel'Veth to scale with AD items basically at all. About 5% as much as intended. So for example, if you had a Bel'Veth with 3 Death Blades, her spell was only dealing 5% of the intended damage. This is a very large buff. This allows, if you were ever putting things like Infinity Edge or Hurricane, you just weren't getting the damage you were supposed to be. So to make up for that, even just the base AD as well, just the way she scales off her base AD. So we are lowering her base AD a little bit, her auto attack speed per spell cast, and that base spell damage. So she is getting a bit of a nerf. And what this should mean, which should be quite healthy, is that itemless Bel'Veth in like stage 2 and stage 3 is going to be a little less powerful than it was before, which is good. But if you itemize your Bel'Veth, especially with on the AD side, that Bel'Veth should actually be doing a ton of damage like it was intended to, and might even be quite strong. So definitely consider Bel'Veth again with that bug fixed. All right, Misfortune. Misfortune kind of undershadowed a little bit by Talia. Is getting a bit of a damage nerf, just a little bit, to make up for the fact that A, Anima should be a lot better now, and B, her spell has been improved quite a bit. She will now always cast towards the largest clump of enemies, so that's a very big buff. And if there's no more enemies in her thing, she will turn slightly quicker to get back to the next target, so she won't waste nearly as much of her spell. So those two things, as well as the ace buff, should put her in just as good a spot, if not better, but that's why we had to bring the damage down just a little bit. All right, Set. Set basically only finding use with people using multiple Bloodthirsters Set is getting quite a bit of a buff here. We want you to be okay and excited to see a Set on like stage 2. So he's going to have 1,000 base HP, which is a pretty big buff. His spell won't take nearly as long to channel, and it'll do even more damage scaling with AD items. So this should bring Set back on the menu. Should be pretty good. Zac. Zac, we like Zac as is. Zac is pretty good. You throw Warmogs on him. He's a lot of effective frontline. But his spell is basically meaningless. You don't really recognize his spell. We want you to consider putting items on Zac and maybe actually use him as a strong tank. And so his spell will now heal him for a bit more. So if you've got things like a Gargoyle on him, you can get more effective health out of him. He'll also deal more damage based on his health. So if you've got, you know, a Warmogs and a Redemption, you can actually deal an okay amount of damage. And the blobs will actually spawn quite a bit quicker. A lot of the times what would happen is you'd kill the first Zac, and then by the time the blobs spawned, they would already run past it. That should happen a lot less. So hopefully this helps make Zac a little bit better. Zed. So this is an interesting one, but we're changing the kill mode duration from 6 to 7 seconds, and then at 3-star from 15 to 7 seconds. The reason this isn't colored is because you could interpret this as both a buff and a nerf. On the one hand, you get longer kill mode time, which means you're doing more damage with that empowered auto attacks and those spins. On the other hand, one of the cool things when he casts his spell is that you get that aggro drop. This does mean he's aggro dropping a little bit less. So again, it's kind of a trade-off here. This is also why we did this at 3-star, because at 3-star we wanted to give him a chance to maybe drop aggro a little bit more often. But in exchange, because we are kind of trying to buff Zed a little bit here, especially with the Duelist nerf, his kill mode is going to have even more damage on top of it, especially at 3-star. Getting 300 base damage per auto is pretty insane, so there should be a pretty sizable buff to Zed 3 and a little bit of a buff to Zed 1 and 2. All right, on the 5-cost side, I'll try to keep this short. Aphelios, the stun gun was just way too good. Oftentimes, people even using it when fully itemized. We don't want that. We're only lowering it a little bit, though, at 1 and 2-star, because we still want Aphelios to be strong, and if you want stuns, go ahead. Instead of overly nerfing that, we're also buffing the blue and red gun. So the blue gun is more about hitting multiple targets and now getting a pretty sizable buff. And the red gun, about taking down 2 key targets, gets a pretty big buff as well. So blue and red gun should hopefully be more useful here. Fiddlesticks, probably one of the biggest champions getting a buff here. He now goes from 90 mana to 66 mana. This will just allow him to hopefully cast his spell a second time if he manages to survive after the first. His armor and MR goes up a little bit. His spell damage goes up about 10%, so it's pretty good. And then this is probably the most interesting one, is he'll come alive a little earlier. Instead of at 60% health, it'll be at 70%. This is nice because it allows you to use things like Zonias and Edge of Night. So you can have him proc and then drop the aggro and do cool things with that if you want to try that. Mordekaiser, very slight buff, 5% damage to a spell. He can hit really hard. We're just trying to make him a little easier to use, so he'll cast just a little sooner into the fight and deal a little bit more damage. So minor buff to Mordekaiser. Same with Syndra. This one's tricky because Syndra is always going to be really bound to her Star Guardian trait. If you have 5 or 7 Star Guardians, Syndra is going to cast like crazy. But we just want to make sure that she's still appealing even outside of Star Guardian. So just a little bit of a mana buff there. Finally, Urgot. Urgot is very powerful and will continue to be. And this will certainly help him. Right now, it really wasn't worth itemizing Urgot, and so we're making sure that's not the case. So both his AD and attack speed ratios are going up, which means the value he gets from things like Deathblade, Hurricane, Last Whisper, things like that is going up. But at 1-star, the spell stun goes down a little bit. So a little less of a CC bot at 1-star, a little more damage and worth itemizing here if you've got those AD items. In addition, we're buffing the chance for him to find a chest. This is most important if you want to try to run AP Urgot. Now you could run something like a Death Cap or an Archangels and maybe get that up to like 40%. So really spawn those chests. As a trade-off, though, we're going to make the chests a little less likely to spawn items. Keep in mind that's still gold, so it's not a big deal. But again, this should make Urgot more of a damage threat and more willing to put AP on him if you want. So Cool. All right, on the item side, blue buff overperforming just a little bit, so we're just taking 5 AP off of it. It's still a very powerful item, but compared to Shojin, in a lot of cases, it was almost always preferable because you get that initial starting mana and the mana on reset. So we're lowering that a little bit. Dragon's Claw, not quite enough magic resist to really make it feel like the anti-magic item, so getting 10 more magic resist, nothing crazy. Giant Slayer, the single most built item in the game, just taking 5% off of its bonus damage. Shouldn't quite be as universally the best item in the game. It's not, but shouldn't make it the thing that you feel like you always need to have. So bringing that down a bit. Hextech Gunblade, widely considered inferior to Bloodthirster. So we're going to let it heal a bit more. So it's more healing than Bloodthirster, but you don't get that shield. So a little bit of buff there. Infinity Edge, just a tiny buff, giving it 5 more AD. So Infinity Edge should be an okay replacement to things like Deathblade. Radiant Giant Slayer gets a bit of a buff. It's underperforming a bit. And then Radiant Protector's Vow will now last 10 seconds. So that should make that shield pretty valuable if you want to go that Radiant Protector's Vow. All right, now we get into the meat, the augments. There's a lot to talk about here. All right, first off, Blue Battery is disabled. We are taking this augment out of the game. The combination of blue buff, blue battery is just way too strong, especially on a lot of champions. So we're gonna take this out. It's gonna be gone probably for the rest of the set. But we have a lot of blue buff champions. We want to be viable with blue buff. We don't want them to feel like they have to get this augment and it break the game a little bit. Built Different 1 and Double Trouble 1 both really didn't feel like they were worth the investment. Would often bait you into playing builds that you probably shouldn't for that level of stats. So we're just going to take those out of the game so you're not baited by that. We still like Built Different and Double Trouble quite a bit. In fact, we're having to nerf Built Different 2 and 3 and Double Trouble 2 and 3 a little bit because they're doing very well, but we're just taking out those bait. So those are gone. And then as I mentioned, Built Different 2 and 3 just losing a little bit of health. Double Trouble losing a bit of its stats. Those should still be good. We want those builds to be fun. They're very fun augments, but maybe not quite as good as they are now. Electro Charge, same thing. It's a little bit too good for how generic it is, especially in the Brawler comp, so lowering the damage just a little bit. High Roller. High Roller is a very fun augment. I think we've seen High Roller threats, using it to get like a 3-star Galio and a 3-star Sivir very early, stuff like that. It doesn't need 6 gold on top of it, so we're going with a very light nerf for now, just lowering it to 3 gold. It probably won't change a lot. High Roller should still be very fun. It's still 3 loaded dice. Jeweled Lotus, lowering it just a little bit. Now that it gives crit to all the physical damage and magic damage, it's a lot more universal and didn't need that extra 5% crit, so taking that away. Luden's scaling very, very well, especially with things like blue buff Zoe, so lowering that damage just a bit as well. Think Fast. Think Fast. If you are skilled, this augment is insane. You can get this at 3-2, 3-star a lot of your board, or at least your key units. That's really powerful on its own. It didn't need 8 gold as well, so we're lowering that to 3. See if that makes a difference. Should still be a strong augment. It is prismatic after all. Thrill of the Hunt 1, the only augment on this page to get a buff. Just going to heal for a little bit more. It's a bit of a bedge augment, if you will. But if you want this, it can be pretty good to get some heals. And then finally, Trade Sector Plus, just 2 less gold. So again, a lot of little adjustments here and there, but the big news is those 3 disabled augments. All right, hero augments. The first thing to note is Lee Sin carry augment has been reworked. That was the one that was giving him a bunch of attack speed every time he cast a spell. Wasn't really that good and didn't make much sense. This one now lets him cast his ability for 30 less mana, and every time he casts, he sheds all negative effects and heals 18% of his missing health. This can be pretty good, so if you want to invest in like a very tanky Lee Sin, it'll cast really often, shield himself and an ally, and then heal himself up a bit. So this should make a Lee Sin tank pretty awesome if you want to try this. All right, Ashe Carry, just a little bit of a buff, more attack speed so that can perform well. Gangplank Carry, a little bit of a buff. Lulu Carry, a little bit of a nerf. Lulu Carry build can get pretty out of control pretty quick. We want to make sure you have to cast a few more times, maybe even go like blue buff and Shojin to really stack that up. Lulu Support, a little bit more AP, underperforming a bit. Lux Carry, you're going to see it later in the small changes, but we put some power in Lux the champion, so Lux is going to get buffed, And then we're going to nerf the hero augment a little bit. So if you get this hero augment, the result should be very similar, but now Lux should be more playable without this augment. The Lux support augment, on the other hand, was very strong, so we're bringing that down just a little bit. Renekton carry, underperforming quite a bit, so hopefully buffing this up to make sure that that's possible to work. Silas carry, same thing, a little bit more health, and remember, his damage scales with health, so this is a pretty big buff to the Silas carry augment. Wukong support augment, really, really good with things like Spell Slingers, just lowering that a little bit so they have to auto a few more times before they cast their spell a second time. Annie carry, don't underestimate this one. So the Annie carry augment is really not great. It's only good in the early game and then kind of falls off. We may end up having to rework it in the future, but for now, we're lowering the internal cooldown on this proc. And what this can mean is while Annie's shield is up, it can now, instead of doing like, it's 185 damage twice a second, it can now deal 5 times in a second. So if you've got an Annie tanking and that shield's up, it can dish out a lot of damage. So don't sleep on this one. This one might be worth exploring. Ezreal carry, as we mentioned, the Ezreal himself got buffed. The carry augment gets nerfed a bit. The Ezreal support augment, this is the one that gives him an Ornn item to an ally. That is already good enough. It didn't need a gold on top of it, so we're taking out the gold. Please note the tooltip will say gain 0 gold until we can fix it next patch, but for now, for balance reasons, you didn't really need that gold. Vi support, instead of giving 200 health, we'll give 180. It's a very powerful augment. Yasuo carry, Yasuo still very good. Now gives 50% Omnivamp, so pretty big nerf here, but again, Yasuo doing very well. And then the Yuumi carry augment, certainly one of the strongest augments in the game, still gives that 100% crit rate and spell crit, just now instead of 30 bonus AP is only going to give 5. So that augment should no longer be very over budget. Alistar carry, this goes up quite a bit. I think Alistar augments are going to be the sleeper strong thing in 13.1. Both these augments got a pretty big buff here. Alistar was already a general use carry, and I think we were seeing some players find some unique builds with Alistar, so definitely don't sleep on these augments. Cho'Gath and Rammus support, both losing 5 armor and MR respectively, so just a little bit of nerf to those. The Rammus carry augment as well was doing just a little bit too much damage, so bringing that down a bit. The Sona carry augment. So the Sona carry augment allows her to shoot a 3rd beam. That's already strong enough as is. She didn't really need 30 bonus AP on top of that, so we're lowering that down to 10. Vayne carry. Now remember, the Vayne carry is when she fires her bolt, she shoots 2 extra bolts. So this is only during her spell, which is only a small percentage of her damage. So we're upping those extra bolts from 50% to 75%, so now she'll shoot 3 pretty solid sized bolts. Vel'Koz support, the chill duration goes from 6 to 8 seconds. So this can really slow down an opponent. Pretty good against duelists, things like that. Aurelion Soul support, 2-second stun goes down to 1.5 second stun. So bit of a nerf there. A lot of people were running things like 2 Aurelion Souls plus 2 Vel'Kozes, and it can just be really frustrating to face. Bel'Veth support, the Voidling HP was a lot of value, so lowering that to 60%. The Samira support augment could get all the way up to 45% attack speed, lowering that down to 40%, which is still very strong. Talia, the champion itself, very strong, did get affected by the 6 Spellslinger nerf, but the hero augments were also very strong. So the carry one goes down to 20 AP and 20 bonus damage. And then the support one, the HP shield on 3 people, goes down to 50%. The Zed support augment, really good in duelists. A lot of the power, especially for duelist comps, is actually in the charge, getting them to their next target quicker. So it didn't really need much more beyond that. So we're lowering the base attack speed from 9% to 7%. And remember, this triples after you get your first kill, so 27 down to 21. A little bit of a nerf there. That augment's still going to be very good in duelist. Aphelios support was way too good in Sure Shot, providing a ton of AD to your comp, lowering that down a bit. On the flip side, the Aphelios carry augment was not very good and took way too long to stack the armor shred, especially because it doesn't actually hit 100%. It just lowers 10% of what they had. So we're letting that stack much quicker now to 20%, so he should be able to ignore a lot of the armor on people pretty quickly. Fiddlesticks carry. This is one that's really fun if you're willing to put Fiddlesticks in the backline. the rest of your team dies, you can gain now upwards of like 2,500 extra health on your fiddlesticks. Then with all that AP from Corrupted, can do some fun stuff. The Nunu carry augment no longer gives him 30 bonus AP, only 10. He's already got the movement speed on top of it. Didn't need much more than that. And then finally, the Syndra support augment could give as much as 54 AP for your team. That's a lot of AP. She doesn't really need that. That's going down to 45, 5 per slot. So and there you go. A lot of hero augment changes. All right, now we're into the small changes. Nothing too crazy here. Anima Squad 7 gets a little bit of a buff just to make sure it's a little bit more worth it. Remember, Silas, Jinx, and Vayne also got buffs, so Anima Squad should be in a lot better spot. Ox Force 4, 6, and 8 just get a little bit more attack speed. 8 probably getting the bigger buff here. So if you want to be able to go Ox Force vertical, should help a little bit. 6 Renegade overperforming a little bit. The jump from 3 to 6 was really high, so lowering that just a little bit, 10%, nothing too crazy. So cool. On the small side, on the champions, Ashe, we're just going to let her cast a little more often. Ashe has kind of fallen off as a carry, and we want to make sure she's an okay AD carry, especially in the early game. Can be a good AD item holder, so making sure she gets a little bit of love. Blitzcrank 1 and 2, not quite as tanky as we want them to really help out admin or maybe an early brawler. So Blitzcrank 1 and 2 get a little bit of a buff. Lux, as I mentioned earlier, gets a bit more damage to make up for the hero augment getting nerfed and to be okay item holder in the early game. Poppy, spell shield going to be a little bit bigger. Now remember, this spell shield only lasts for like 3 seconds. So a lot of the times it was already kind of wasted, but just in the cases it's not, we want to make sure he can shield himself and survive just a little longer. Cho'Gath, a little bit of a nerf at 2 and 3 star. Nothing crazy. And again, it's just his damage and his relationship to MR. So he still does that Mana Reave, still does a decent chunk of damage. LeBlanc 3, already quite strong. LeBlanc 1 and 2 just get a little buff here, not even 10%, to help LeBlanc be a good carry in the early game. Neela healing. Neela healing can get out of control really quick if you're willing to itemize her. So just lowering that a little bit. Rammus gets a bit of a buff at 1 star and a bit of a nerf at 3 star. But again, this is only the damage, which isn't really what you run Rammus for anyway. You run Rammus for the strong tank and big AoE CC. None of that got changed, so Rammus should be just fine. Senna gets a little bit of a buff on her spell at 1 and 2 star. Nothing too crazy, just helping fill out the framework. And then a little bit of a math error on the 3 star here, so nothing crazy. You're probably barely going to notice it, but just making sure her spell hits for the correct amount there. Aurelion Soul, bit of a nerf at 3 star, overperforming at 3 star, doing a ton of damage, probably too much, so small nerf there. Samira gets a buff at 3 star. That spell should really be hitting people real hard here, so hitting that. Soraka, bit of a nerf at 3 star, just 1 less target, so nothing crazy. Also needs to be healing herself less. This is really going to hurt the brawler Soraka, but she didn't need to be healing for like 400 a spell cast, so lowering that a bit. Viego gets a little bit of a health buff to make sure he's more survivable, and then a very, very tiny damage buff here. You can see it's like not even 5%, but we have to be really careful because Viego is very thresholdy, but this should help him at least get a few more executes. And then Nunu and Willump, just a little bit less base damage. They can do a lot of damage and be very tanky and be very distracting, which is good, just maybe not quite as much. So, small things there. All right, small quality of life change here, thanks to Kent. Coins from the following augments will now vacuum to the player after spawning, so you don't have to run after and grab them. They can just go straight to you. But AFK, birthday present, calculated loss, high-end shopping, high roller, late game specialist, Pandora's Bench, rich get richer, think fast, trade sector plus, windfall, and the trait augments. So you pick the augment, you get the gold, it'll appear and vacuum to you and let you focus on your roll downs and stuff like that. Finally, bug fixes. And before I start reading all these, please remember, if you don't see anything on this list, we're working on it. We're aware of it. You don't need to say, what about this bug? We know. We're working on it. But quite a few bugs here. The Lee Sin support hero augment tooltip has been updated to correctly state that your units gain attack speed when receiving any shield, not just Lee Sin's. This is just a text change, so nothing changed. Talia support augment and Viego support augments now work on ghost armies. Defenders will no longer taunt enemies already attacking defenders at the start of the combat. This should help reduce some of the weird targeting bugs we were seeing. Lee Sin will no longer T-pose if he dies while casting a spell. Great. Clear Mind no longer treats armories as champions. This is things like Anvil. You're not going to lose your Clear Mind because of an Anvil. Hacker combating targeting rework should no longer switch combat targets while their target is alive. Hopefully this helps a bit. I'm sure we still got a little bit more work to do on Hacker, but this should help things a little bit. Hacker Tooltip, the on kill, as I mentioned earlier, has now been changed to properly reflect that the bonus is giving to the killer. So cool. 2 Vel'Koz casting on the same unit should no longer fizzle the first to cast. Cool. So a buff to 2 Vel'Koz. Yay. Urgot Tooltip has been fixed to show that he does scale with attack speed, so that should be more clear. Lucky Gloves now gives Neela tank items. It won't give Fiddlesticks mana items, and will no longer give Kaisa AD items, so some buffs to Lucky Gloves there. Bloodthirster Shield now correctly procs once when multiple Bloodthirsters are equipped. You still get a stacked shield, but only once, so that fixes the Bloodthirster issue we saw at the end of the patch. Laser Core Drones no longer benefit from damage increasing items such as Giant Slayer. This was not intended. Thank you for pointing this out, Clear. Fixed a bug where a vault would always open if Underground was deactivated within the first second of planning phase. This was a bit of an exploit. Should be fixed now, so people can't cheat Underground anymore. Fixed a bug where one of the Underground 4 heist payouts offered a less value than intended. And fixed a bug where Bel'Veth would visually register attacks as critical strikes when they were in fact not critical strikes. So there you go. That is patch 13.1. Lot to go on there. Should be a big thing. Should refresh the meta a little bit and add some quality of life stuff. We hope you're looking forward to it. Also, like I said, some new cosmetics to check out. I'm personally a big fan of the new map. Check out the intro. The new intro to the new map is really cool. Check that thing out. Yeah, so there you go. That is our first patch of 2023. We hope you had great holidays, and we can't wait for you to enjoy this patch. All right, that's going to do it for me. Until next time, take it easy.